The starting point of my book is you could call it a conundrum that although we all know how important food is, somehow we've landed ourselves with a global food system that generates hunger alongside of obesity, climate change, waste, health problems, and somehow public responsibility has been sold out to corporations and markets, while the frontline actors of food security, the families, the communities, the small-scale producers, have been disempowered. So my book explores how this has happened and what we might be able to do about it. Based above all on my own experience that Tim has alluded to, I'm ashamed to say 4 decades in the food world, really on the interface between African villages and UN meeting halls, and my efforts to make sense out of what I was experiencing, which led me progressively to ask questions that have to do with power. Who wields it? To whose benefit? Who frames the food agenda? What actors weigh in when decisions are being taken? And what prospects are there to address imbalances of power and to defend common goods and public interests? And this is the terrain that I'll be covering this afternoon. Okay, now if we do a review of the history of the global governance of food in the post-war period, we find that the same problems are still with us. Already in 1944, the basic instruments that the first Director General of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, Lord Boyd Orr, requested in order to be able to privilege people's needs over grain traders' profits, global food reserves, regulating agricultural trade, were denied to him by the big powers of the time, who were Britain and the US, essentially. Food is more than a commodity was his parting thrust when he resigned in frustration from FAO just 4 years after he took up his post. And it's still a slogan of the food sovereignty movement today. So food regime analysis can help us to understand this continuity by illuminating how world capitalism in different phases has organized agricultures in order to enhance commercial profits. The British Empire, the US, handing over to the transnational corporations. Now, these regimes emerge out of contests between these powerful economic, political actors and social actors, workers, farmers, until some kind of an equilibrium is reached between profit and welfare. And once that happens, the rules by which they operate seem to be natural, just the way things are, like free trade, until the equilibrium starts to break down. And we're in a period now where the equilibrium is breaking down, and so questions can and should be asked about the rules of the game that have facilitated an astounding concentration of the power of transnational agri-food corporations over the past 2 decades. And you have the same story in the multinational input industry. And the retail market. Supermarket chains have moved into the global south, aided by global policies that have opened up these economies to unregulated foreign investment. Just to give you one figure, the number of Walmarts in Mexico post-NAFTA has risen from 14 in 1994 to, guess how many in 2012? Anyone want to throw out a figure? 1,724, and you can imagine the impact on small-scale traders and producers. So corporations exercise their power also through the increasingly important role they've come to play in the regulation of the food system through the rise of private standards and the decline of the state's regulatory role. They also expend enormous amounts of money seeking to influence consumer choice and public opinion to their benefit, as in a referendum decision on GMO labeling in California in 2012, where in the last 5 months they put in this amount of money to make sure that consumers could not know whether or not there were GMOs in their food. Another pernicious class of actors has entered into the globalized food system more recently: speculative financial capital. And the corporate-led food regime relies on a global market organized in a way that favors its operations. What percentage of all food consumed in the world transits through the world market? What would you guess? Anyone want to hazard a figure? I'm strong on figures today. 10%. Sorry? Well, actually, you've undercut me. It's 14%, but that just shows you that the vast majority of food is consumed in the country or region in which it originates, and yet the impacts of the way the global market is organized and the speculation it permits are visited on countries whose share in the world market is really minimal, but have been sucked into it by the structural adjustment and the trade rules. And this is the case above all in Africa, not only, but above all. So what's the impact on small-scale food producers? The global corporate food chains are intimately connected to an industrialized model of agriculture production. And one result is the expulsion of small-scale producers to make room for plantations. An alternative is contract farming linked to corporate-led value chains, whereby small-scale producers are sort of hooked on to this engine of the value chain. It sounds better because they're left on their land, but it's really not that much better because they are left to shoulder the climatic and all of the other manifold risks that agriculture entails. And yet, at the same time, they're subject to corporate control over what they plant, how they plant it, when they plant it, what price they get. So they sacrifice the autonomy that has been the basis of the resilience of small-scale family farmers for eons. And then corporate value chains have a funny way of rewarding everyone else more than the primary producers, as you can see in this example here from the cocoa chain, 6%, down from 16 in 1980. Yet, the corporate narrative assumes that the future for small-scale family farmers lies in linking up with the industrial food chains for those better resourced ones who can manage to do so, and becoming advanced farmers, as you can see in red in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, while the rest will be migrated out of agriculture in the elegant formulation of the Syngenta Foundation, which produced this graph. Where will they be migrated to? That's somebody else's problem, not the corporations. So what do those directly concerned have to say about this? And let's remember that we're talking about some 3 billion people. This is not an archaic minority. Rural people have been organizing around the world, particularly over the past 2 decades, in reaction to the impacts of the neoliberal policies. And the need to reach all the way up to the global level became increasingly evident with the advent of the World Trade Organization in 1995, where decisions continued to be taken ever more at the global level that fell on the shoulders of the small-scale producers. And in fact, the best known and largest global peasant movement, La Via Campesina, I don't know if you've all heard of La Via Campesina, many of you I'm sure have, saw the day in 1993, just as the WTO was coming up on the screen. The World Food Summits, organized by FAO, and above all, the parallel civil society forums, provided a impetus impetus for the global networking of these rural movements, in good part due to a deliberate political choice on the part of the organizers to put the rural social movements in the majority and in the decision-making role in determining the positions that civil society would bring to the intergovernmental summits. And this contrasts strongly with other UN processes in which NGOs have tended to dominate. And with this slide, I ask you all if you are aware of the important distinction. Of course, civil society is a large and heterogeneous category. There's a bit of everything there. But there is a very important distinction to be made between NGOs that undertake services for disadvantaged people, but they do not represent them, although sometimes they act as though they do. and people's organizations, which are established by peasants, artisanal fisher folk, et cetera, and are mandated to speak for them and are accountable to them. And this is an extremely important distinction. It has to do with legitimacy, who has the right to speak for whom. So it's important to keep that in mind. And the social movements have developed their own alternative paradigm. Have all of you heard of food sovereignty? Yeah, I think so. Okay. So
I can assume it's a literate audience.
Right. Okay. Well, so yeah, no, it is. I'm very pleased with that. So this is just a summary for those who are less literate. And they've also established a network, a global network, to carry forward their engagement with global institutions, the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty, the necessity of which you can imagine if you think of how difficult or impossible it would be for individual peasant organizations or fisher folk in Thailand to interact with FAO, et cetera. So over the past decade, the IPC has opened up significant space for these movements in FAO policy fora where they had never set foot before, and has also coached them in how to occupy it. It's not enough to be in the room if you don't know what to say, how to say it, and how to make a convincing case of your argument. So let's look at what they're proposing as against the global corporate food system, remembering, as I'm sure you all know, that it's not an opposition between North and South, but between two different approaches to food provisioning. The term local in local food webs can mean different things in different contexts, but it always highlights the dimension of control by the people of a given territory over a whole series of things that globalization tends to remove from their control. While the word web contrasts quite nicely with the word chain and emphasizes the interconnectedness of people involved in food provisioning. In the global South, in the global North, initiatives to reconnect consumers to sources of healthy food are proliferating, as I'm sure many of you are involved in some. And in the global South, the dominance of small-scale family farming and local food webs is simply overwhelming. Family farms produce over 70% of Brazil's food supply. In Africa, it's up to 80%, yet the support that they receive from the public sector is minimal. Building blocks of food systems that are alternative to the corporate system are being put in place locally throughout the world. People are fighting to defend their access to and control over natural resources, land, seeds. Agroecological production models are gaining recognition. In 2004, the few FAO experts who were interested in agroecology had to practically congregate in the corridors and whisper. They were so much against the mainstream. And now, last September, just 10 years later, FAO organized a major symposium on agroecology at which the Director General declared today a window was open in what for 50 years has been the cathedral of the Green Revolution. So I cite this example particularly for the younger people in the room, just to emphasize that change can happen. It takes time, it takes effort, but it does happen. This is the toughest area of all because of the domination of a single idea of the market. And yet, of course, the world is full of markets that decentralize the encounter between supply and demand, and that respond to criteria other than profit alone. Another important pillar of food sovereignty is approaches to research and the generation of knowledge that do not ignore but rather build on and enhance local knowledge. In my book, I look briefly at how the two contrasting food systems impact on major challenges like maintaining dwindling biodiversity, protecting the health of the world's population, combating food waste, addressing climate change. When you add all of this up, there's no doubt as to which approach to food provisioning scores better. Now, the fallback argument for supporters of the global corporate food system is that whether we like it or not, only industrial agriculture can double food production by 2050 to feed the growing population. And I'm sure you've heard this argument every other day in the press. But in fact, it rests on several highly questionable assumptions. The first is that the world's population will indeed rise beyond 9 billion by 2050, ignoring the fact that average family size worldwide has dropped by about half over the past 4 decades and will continue to drop the more women are empowered. So we have a choice. We can invest in chemical inputs or in women's empowerment. And the second is that we do indeed need to double food production, whereas on the contrary, there's overwhelming evidence that the amount of food, the supply of food is adequate today and will be tomorrow. And the problem is unequal and inequitous access to food. And this obviously requires political attention and not fiddling with the technical aspects of productivity. And finally, the corporate narrative assumes that industrial high-tech agriculture is indeed more productive than agroecological family farming. And this is a false thesis that has been disproved on many occasions. The latest rebuttal is a study that was published by a group of University of California, Berkeley researchers last December. So in conclusion, it's the smiling lady in the center of the slide who has the answer and not the dour gentleman around the margins. Alternative building is grounded in local situations, but it's progressively reaching outward, networking, building alliances, including with local authorities. For example, in the form of local food policy councils that are spreading in the UK, in which citizens take food provision back into their hand. And national policies also can empower people. I'm sure many of you, if not all, have heard of the Brazilian Zero Hunger program, which is an extremely interesting and important national policy which has a whole series of aspects. But one of them is public procurement from local family farmers for feeding programs in schools and hospitals and social protection schemes. So it's a real win-win enterprise. A very authoritative report published by the UN Committee on World Food Security a couple of years ago made the important point that transformations in agriculture are not inevitable. They're the result of political choices, explicit or implicit. And you're not going to get appropriate policies without transparent democratic political processes that involve smallholder organizations, among others. So there's an issue of who decides and on what basis decision makers consider that they can count on scientific information to provide them with objective grounds for what's termed evidence-based policy. To what degree is this founded? In fact, evidence is framed by the paradigms we adopt that condition the assumptions we make. And just take a look at this excerpt from Truman's famous Point 4 inaugural address and tell me what assumptions leap out at you. That's an assumption, yeah. The whole term of underdeveloped is open to debate.
Producing more will solve the problem.
I'm sorry?
Producing more is
solves the problem, exactly, exactly. And finally, that modern scientific and technical knowledge is the way to produce more. So, this is a whole program, and it's all, totally open to discussion. Yet, productivism is still alive and well 7 decades later, and it underlies the discourse that supports the corporate regime, which, among other things, privileges Western science and technology. This is just one example of how it does so by adopting measures that glorify external inputs like yield for plant. If you want to measure productivity, which is fair enough. It makes a big difference if you take a single plant and see how much that single plant produces, which of course is enhanced if you give it all kinds of fertilizer and hybrid seeds and blah, 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 blah. Or if you look at the total yield per diversified field, as in the agroecological optic, where the benefits that you're looking at are not just how much is produced, but also the impact on the environment, et cetera, et cetera. So even if you want to measure productivity, there are different ways of going about it. And
I just want to say what a great picture that is. You've got
the top one or the bottom? Isn't it wonderful? I know, I know. That's the fun of preparing these lectures. And productivism also very conveniently ignores the structural causes of hunger and malnutrition. It's just a question of flinging those inputs in. Now, evidence is also framed by the questions that are asked and the data that is looked for and that's available. A recent study on sustainable food systems in Africa, undertaken by small-scale food producers organizations themselves, that I'm very proud to have been associated with, found that statistics only exist about the so-called modern commercial commodity and export markets. There's simply no information available about the informal markets, which provide most of the food consumed by people in the region, but are not considered to be worthy of research. And the result of this gap in information collection is that these food markets are invisible. They're just not taken into account in policy decision-making, despite their evident importance for food security. So what's billed as objective evidence, but often isn't, acts against political accountability and against value-based political debate, which is often necessary. There's not a right or a wrong answer. And yet we end up with, well, that's the way it is, just look at the evidence, rather than we've thought about this and this is what we want as a society. They're two very different things. And this is the significance of the reform of the UN Committee on World Food Security, the first ever global policy forum in which small-scale producers are at the table and their evidence has to be listened to. The food price crisis opened up a window of political opportunity for change that the food sovereignty movement was ready to seize because of a decade of capacity building and networking. You can have moments of political opportunity that no one's ready to do anything with, but in this case, they were. The crisis unveiled a global governance vacuum in the absence of an authoritative and democratic global food security forum. Decisions in this fundamental area were being taken by default by institutions and actors who have no legitimacy to do so. Among the international community's reactions to the crisis, the only one that sought policy-led solutions to the causes of the crisis was a proposal for the reform of the existing, but at that time ineffectual, UN Committee on World Food Security. And against all odds, this last option won out thanks to an alliance among a number of governments, particularly from the Global South, who were sick of having the G8 dictate what was going to happen to them, FAO, and the rural social movements who had built up their capacity for advocacy to the point where they could really weigh in on this issue. The reform was an inclusive and transparent process in which the IPC, the global network, facilitated participation by rural movements, helping to block attempts by some governments to limit the political weight of this new forum. And all of the characteristics that I've put up here on the board are ones that were very hotly debated and very strenuously defended by the social movements. The fact that the CFS deliberates on food issues from a human rights perspective, food is an unalienable right. It's not just a desirable outcome. The fact that civil society organizations are full participants, not observers as elsewhere in the UN system. They intervene in the debate on the same footing as governments, and they work alongside of the Intergovernmental Bureau all year round. The private sector is there as well, but as a separate constituency. They're not confounded with civil society. And decision-making takes place in front of everybody in plenary sessions, not in closed-door drafting committees. So that's a big step forward for accountability. At the end of the debate, it's the governments who decide. Some people feel that this is a limitation of the power of civil society, but in fact, it's civil society who wanted it that way. Because if the governments are not the decision makers, they can't be held accountable. So civil society wanted the governments to be the decision makers at the end, after having had to listen to their evidence and before their eyes, but they wanted the governments to decide and to be able to be held accountable. An important part of the reform was recognition of civil society's right to self-organization, not to have governments say, you can come in the room and you can't, and this is the hat you have to wear, and et cetera, et cetera. So the civil society designed its own mechanism and self-governs it, and drew up the rules of the game, which came from the IPC experience, that priority is given to the voices of organizations representing those most affected by food insecurity. NGOs are only one of 11 constituencies. So on paper, there's never been a global forum like this, but what does it look like in practice? I'm going to focus briefly on issues of land tenure, land grabbing, and investment in agriculture, because they're at the very heart of the contest between the two different approaches to food provision that we looked at briefly before. When the phenomenon of land grabbing hit the headlines in 2008, there were two opposing responses from the international community. Something had to be done. The G8 asked the World Bank to develop what they called principles for responsible agricultural investment, which were viewed by civil society as essentially a whitewash of land grabbing. For a number of reasons, they welcome large-scale investments, including large-scale land acquisition, as an opportunity for development, not recognizing the negative impacts that these can have. There's no reference to human rights. There's no reference to state obligations. It's assumed that the corporations will just self-regulate. And there was no corporate consultative process whatsoever behind them, not even with governments, let alone civil society. Or the other proposal was to negotiate guidelines on the governance of tenure coming out of a whole decade of social movement engagement on this important issue of agrarian reform and land tenure. The very first session of the Reformed Committee on World Food Security in October 2010 had these two very different proposals on the table, and there was acrimonious debate up till 3 a.m. one morning, in which civil society and social movements played a determinant role in obtaining the outcome that the committee agreed to negotiate the tenure guidelines, refused to rubber stamp the PRI, the World Bank principles, despite the fact that some G8 governments put a lot of pressure on, and decided instead to launch a consultation in the Committee on World Food Security to try to see what kind of principles regarding investment would be required if the objective is to ensure that investment in agriculture supports food security and the right to food, not corporate profits. So the tenure guidelines were the subject of 2 years of intense negotiation. As always, there were wins and losses, but these guidelines are based on principles of universal human rights. That was strongly opposed and strongly defended and got through. They're strong on a number of issues that are very important for social movements, like recognition of customary tenure, for example, not just individual property rights, et cetera. And they provide important safeguards against large-scale land acquisition, although they don't denounce them completely, which is what civil society would have liked to see. And it's agreed by all that these outcomes would not have been possible in a less inclusive political forum. So, what difference do they make in the field? Not surprisingly, the G8 and the corporations are tending to pay lip service to the tenure guidelines while continuing to push for opening up access to land for corporations through private sector friendly policy changes in countries in Africa, and the new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition, of which, alas, the British government is a strong supporter, is a prime example of an instrument to do this kind of nasty business. The social movements, instead, are trying to put the tenure guidelines at the service of people's struggles in countries throughout the world, and not only in the global south, as you can see. And the fact that they were so strongly engaged in developing the guidelines gives them a sense of ownership that makes all the difference if you contrast them, for example, with the Millennium Development Goals or the Sustainable Development Goals today, which are floating up in the air somehow. The examples that are evoked on this slide and many, many others are presented in a people's manual on the guidelines that is going to be published quite shortly, which was based on a collective process of popular education with consultations in all regions, and takes concrete experiences of people's struggles as the starting point to turn the guidelines into a living support for people's struggles. So you don't start with the guideline, you start with what people are fighting for, and then show how the guidelines can be supportive, can be relevant. Land grabbing, of course, is only the most visible aspect of a broader effort to orient investments in agriculture to promote the corporate food system. And thanks in good part to social movement engagement, it has proved possible to make progress in changing the terms of the debate in the Committee on World Food Security. It's been officially recognized in policy recommendations that it's the small-scale producers, not governments or corporations, who are responsible for most of the investment in agriculture. They're the big, big blue line on this FAO bar graph. The corporations are the smallest one at the end. And what's more, that investment is not just about money. We tend to equate investment with money, but most of the valuable investment in agriculture actually takes the form of labor and knowledge that farmers invest in their land day by day. And at the same time, they also produce the food that meets the demand of most of the world's population. So it wouldn't take a PhD from the courses here at this university to understand that the most convincing winning strategy to support food security is to defend and support the small-scale producers' own efforts. But this logic continues to be contested, obviously, by the proponents of the corporate food regime. It was hoped that this policy guidance about the importance of small-scale food producers' own investments could be strengthened when the Committee on World Food Security got underway, got around to negotiating its own principles about responsible agricultural investment. But these RAI turned out to be very strongly contested for several reasons. First of all, they are potentially well suited to use by corporations and by private sector friendly bilateral and multilateral aid programs to whitewash their operations by cherry picking a few relatively innocuous principles from the whole text of the principles on responsible agricultural investment. You pick out just gender, shall we say, or just something like that, and then forget about all of the tougher, more economic principles and say, well, we're complying, we're applying the RAI. So this is one reason why it was an important effort by governments and corporations to to get what they wanted into the rye. And secondly, and this in a sense is an indicator of the success of the Committee on World Food Security. When it was born, everybody thought it was, just a fly-by-night. But over the past 5 years, it has become an important and recognized policy forum. And as a result, the big powers are in the room and they're much more combative. So that's a sign of success, and you just have to deal with it. And so civil society, non-negotiable, what are called red lines, were crossed on several occasions, and the assessment was negative on some important points. But at the same time, it's recognized that the fact of having sidetracked the World Bank PRI, which had no consultative process behind them whatsoever, no mention of government responsibilities, et cetera, and having upheld the primacy of political decision-making. You can't get away with regulating investment in agriculture in a meeting room in the World Bank or in a corporate meeting room. And upholding the responsibility of governments is in itself a victory. So the Committee on World Food Security does make a difference, but there are challenges. And one of the most important ones is that its products are voluntary. As I'm sure you know, only the WTO and the Security Council really have the clout to enforce what they come out with. So these products have to be picked up by governments and translated into national legislation to become binding. And here we run up against the ambiguous role of states who, alas, are currently among the worst offenders in promoting narrow objectives. Just think of the whole climate change situation. And who yet are a basic building block until we have something better. It's what we need to count on for accountability and for defending citizens' collective rights. So we need to hold governments to account, and that requires building stronger links between adopting progressive norms at the global level and what really makes the difference, in my view, social and political mobilization from below. And this is a major challenge for the Committee on World Food Security. And I'd like to close now by just taking a look at what next. I believe, and it'll be interesting to hear what you think, that we're really coming pretty close to the ecological, socio-economic, and political limits of today's global food system. The corporations are advocating ever more sophisticated and terrifying technological solutions. As you can see, we can forget about farmers altogether and just let the drones get on with the job. But there are alternatives, as we've seen. So what are some of the key issues that need to be addressed in order to empower communities and regulate corporations? Apologists of the corporate food system try to ignore issues of power. We instead have to recognize them, and will be in good company with people like Olivier de Schutter. We have to insist on accountable governments rather than letting ourselves be seduced by what I call vaporous multi-stakeholderism that lets everyone into the room on the same footing without making distinctions. So inevitably, the most powerful, in our case the corporations, rule the roost, and government accountability evaporates. And for example, in national platforms, should national actors only be in the room deciding what's best for their society? Or should there be foreign donors, multilaterals, corporations? This is in Bangladesh, when it's a question of deciding whether to promote nutrition through small-scale diversified agriculture and diets or through corporation-manufactured supplements. Who is it that decides national policy? Take a look at the lineup in this multi-stakeholder platform, and I defy those of you who have the best eyesight to pick out a couple of Bangladeshi ministries, but they certainly do not have top billing. So there's a confusion of different actors and their roles and responsibilities. And even in the case of the Committee on World Food Security, where at least actors are clearly identified. The private sector is here, and the civil society is there, and the governments, etc. But even there's some questions you can ask. Should there be balance between the corporate private sector, whose bottom line obviously is profit? It's not their baddies. That's what they're about. It's the logic of their operations. Should there be balance between them and organizations that represent those most affected by food insecurity? And if they are in the room, is it not necessary to acknowledge and address potential conflicts of interest? A related issue is the need to debunk public-private partnerships, which is a buzzword these days. I'm sure you've all heard about them, the role of private sector. There is no evidence that they contribute to food security. Even the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Netherlands, who is very private sector friendly, says so. Yet, recipient governments are enjoined to establish enabling environments for corporations, and donor governments use our aid dollars as what's called patient capital. Patient capital is public money that covers the upfront costs so that corporations can start to make profits right away. They don't have to wait to cash in on their investments. And of course, you have to ask yourself, what would happen if that same money were invested instead in the small-scale producers who are really doing the job? And public-private partnerships most often fail to define the obligations and regulate the behavior of the private partners, which brings us to that contested word, regulation. There's a lot of talk about corporate social responsibility, but research demonstrates that the uptake of corporate social responsibility, in fact, concerns only a minimal part of corporate behavior. It's mostly corporations with well-known brand names like Coca-Cola, who care about what the public thinks of their brand. But even these pick and choose which measures to apply at the lowest cost and the greatest visibility. This is just one well-known example of a multi-stakeholder platform that practices corporate social responsibility, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil that some of you may have heard of. I'd like you to just take a look at the list of categories of stakeholders who are around the table and tell me who you think are missing, who ought to be there but aren't. Sorry?
It looks like the labor organizations.
Right. Well, the workers who are being exploited and poisoned with pesticides are not at the table, for example.
They're not under growers.
Sorry? No. The growers, in fact, if you look into the detail, are mostly big growers. Any other?
The indigenous people who live in the environment.
Well,
Where the
indeed.
plantations are missing as well.
Indeed. And peasants who are kicked off the land to make room for the plantations. And there's one...
Environmental NGOs become the proxy for...
Yeah. Yes, they do. But of course, that's not okay because, as I said earlier, they don't really have the right to speak for people. People can speak for themselves. They have their own organization. And there's one other extremely important category.
Government?
Yeah, whose responsibility if you don't have governments there? So transnational corporations' rights are protected by hard laws with strong tools for enforcement, but their obligations are backed only by soft laws. And this is really becoming common knowledge. So what to do about it? And this is an open question. This is one of the points I hope we'll discuss afterwards. I believe that the international human rights framework is one good starting point for assigning political responsibility for corporate behavior. We have this thing known as the Maastricht Principles that were developed in 2012 that detail the obligations of states to ensure that businesses based in their territories respect human rights standards when they operate abroad. So the British government is responsible for the behavior of British corporations when they operate abroad. And since last June in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, there is actually work has begun on developing a treaty for binding obligation on transnational corporations that was roundly opposed by the EU, the US, Canada, Australia, et cetera, et cetera. But at least the fact that this dossier is open and work has begun on it is already an important thing. Building accountable food governance from the bottom up can be done. Under pressure from citizens, national governments are daring to challenge global rules on issues like using public procurement and food stocks for food security. In India, there was this big battle with the WTO just recently. Or raising tariffs in Cameroon to protect local poultry production from dumped frozen chicken parts. But citizen-led decision-making has to be protected from abuses like the latest generation of bilateral trade and investment partnerships. I'm sure all of you have heard about the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is being negotiated behind closed doors, but in close corporate consultation with the corporate lobbies. As you can see, 74% of the consultations that DG Trade has held have been with the corporate lobbies. And there is now a massive citizens campaign underway in Europe to turn a spotlight on this, and I'm hopeful that they may succeed in, if not blocking it, at least taking the most dangerous provisions off the table. So it can happen. I started this talk by citing a wise and intransigent elderly statesman, Lord Boyd Orr. And as we come to the close, I'd like to quote another who rather resembles him, funnily enough, law professor and human rights activist Richard Falk, who has raised really the same question that Lord Boyd Orr was addressing: what to do when what must be done for the sake of sustainability and survival exceeds what is possible politically. That's the situation we find ourselves in. And his answer involves two main elements. On the one hand, wresting legitimacy from those who are using discourse to justify the neoliberal order and investing it instead in those who are working to build more equitable and sustainable alternatives. And on the other, promoting what he calls a robust dialectic between functional centralization to address global problems. You've got to have something happen centrally, but at the same time, a determined politics of decentralization and diffusion of power to levels where citizens can weigh in. And this is really a pretty good description of the agenda the food sovereignty movement is pursuing. So we're left with the question of whether the movement will be able to fragment the global domination of the corporate food system in favor of a territorially rooted and governed approach to food provision, and whether the Committee on World Food Security can continue to fulfill its promise of being a global forum that actually supports rather than squashing local initiatives. These are open questions, but I'd like to give the last word to West African peasant leader Mamadou Sissoko, who has been a companion in arms of mine over the past 3 decades of experience that I've drawn on in writing my book. And the last time we were together, I asked him whether he felt hopeful about the possibility of attaining the kind of change that we've been fighting for. And he replied, "You know, Nora, sometimes when we lose a battle, I wonder if we shouldn't just give up, but it doesn't last long. I think about how far we've come and about all that's moving today, and I'd like to live for another 100 years. So I leave you with this hopeful message and incitement to engage, because it's our food system and it's going to take us all to change it for the better." Thank you.
I think you were raising three points on which I am troubled. The first is, I don't buy the argument about food sovereignty. Now I'm contentious on this. A lot of people don't like me saying it. This is a great argument for land-based food systems. 70% of the world's food is produced by small producers. You're absolutely right. That's the standard position. But that 70% doesn't feed the majority of the world. The majority of the world is now urbanized and increasingly dependent upon non-small producer produced food systems. The food sovereignty argument is utterly brilliant, incredibly powerful, well organized. But is it the sum, this is my question to you, Nora, is it the sum of the analysis and of the movement that is needed to address an urbanized food world? That's question number one. Two, I think there would be not many of us would disagree here that there's a problem of food governance. I thought you were incredibly optimistic about the CFS. It is remarkable for those who followed this and followed the change from what the present formulation of the Committee on Food Security is compared to what it was and the need for reform. We've done research on this too, and there is a nasty undertow, which is even as the CFS has become more democratic, more open, more effective in articulating the real voices from below, the more it has been marginalized. So my question to you is it as influential as you think it is? And my third question is about whether corporations have got it in as much control as you presented. I like the simplicity of your analysis, corporations versus the people, the top versus the bottom, the people versus small, highly capitalized interest. It's great for rhetoric. But the world is messier than that. And in particular, I think there is something really missing from the analysis you presented to us. I know you don't think this, but the analysis so far, let's open it up, which is that farming is not anywhere near the dominant force it was. Indeed, agriculture is highly marginalized in the modern food system. We need agriculture. We need, you had one slide up, farming, fisheries, forests. Absolutely. The land, the planet is where the food comes from. It comes from the biosphere. But if we look at where the economic power is, it's nowhere near the land. They don't need the land. The land is, as it were, filtered through to the urban majority through the hands of very small, off-the-land power brokers. And I think that takes me back to my initial question. I'm not a critic of food sovereignty. How can one be against the food sovereignty movement? It's a really powerful and important movement. It's wonderful at one level, seeing this view from below articulate itself and be well organized. But it's not the same thing. We don't have a food sovereignty movement or equivalent in the urbanized majority of the world. It's a land-based small producer movement. Very important, but not the sum of what we argue frequently, or myself argue frequently, which is we don't yet know what food democracy looks like for an urbanized world. Food sovereignty may be one element of it. It's a peasants' movement. But what about the urbanized majority?
I thought it was all really interesting, really, really interesting. But I'm interested in what is perhaps a dilemma for you, which has been a dilemma for me in my work. I have been looking at social dimensions of sustainability in the industrial food supply in the UK in an urban setting like Tim's talking about. But when you put up your definition of food sovereignty, it embodied the idea that it was participatory, inclusive, governed from below, all of those things, but also that it was ecologically sound. And I wonder how you reconcile those two strands, which is the classic fissure within sustainability of the self-determining social element and the element of environmental protection, why do you argue that it is implicit within agroecology that popular movements would protect the environment, the ecology, more effectively? Why do you assume that is an inevitable development? Because within sustainability, it's sometimes it's argued that that's always a choice, it's always an option, that actually the route to a sustainable world does not necessarily lie through participatory methods. You have to choose them always. That would be my question.
One question.
Or reactions to Tim, or to, I'm not the.
Trying to get people going.
Yeah.
Yes, David Barling, Centre for Food Policy. Hi, Nora. My question, two things actually, since we're gathering all the questions at once. But one is, if we look at the responsible palm oil stakeholder you put up, there are alternative certification schemes and platforms being put up by the governments where those palm oil plantations are, notably in Indonesia. And the environmental NGOs are extremely worried about this because it means they see it as meaning that the vested corporate interests have greater control as a result of the certification process through direct access to the governments, who are, as you say, probably the most legitimate stakeholder in that area. So there is a problem if we leave it to the governments that they may not do what we consider to be socially just. So that's really the question is there, how do we reconcile that, and what's your thoughts on that, using that particular example you gave? The other thing that I just wanted to mention was, from work we did looking at the Committee on Food Security, as you know, we had Jess Duncan doing a PhD here.
Yeah.
One thing that we picked up was that when it came to the links between food security discussions in FAO and including this Committee on Food Security, and then other international arenas like climate change negotiations, there was a lack of integration or crossover. And indeed, where the civil society mechanism and the CFS looked at climate change, they actually said it should be left to the convention, the Framework Convention, and the next protocol decisions to make those decisions. And I just wondered where we can make the links, using your thinking particularly about your bottom-up process between those two separate regimes, because this is something that's really been puzzling me about how we can actually cross over between food security and the crucial environmental regimes which govern the ecosystems on which food security rests.
I think that's probably enough for but I won't give definitive answers to any of these questions because nobody could. Well, starting off with Tim's questions, I personally tend to put food sovereignty, food justice, food democracy in something of the same basket. I don't think they're opposing visions. I think it's to some degree a question of terminology, who uses words to mean what. But I think what is more important is the fact I think the opposition between urban and rural is something that has to be done away with. And in fact, I'm old enough.
Done away with or addressed?
Addressed, sorry, overcome, superseded. I'm thinking a bit in Italian, but superseded or addressed and addressed. But I'm old enough to remember when the term urban drift started to be used in the 70s, wasn't it? Yeah, and it was just assumed that people will drift to urban areas. And there was a minority that was not being listened to that said they won't necessarily drift to urban areas if there are investments in rural economies, if there are investments to avoid having a single capital city that just happens to be on the sea so that export crops could be taken out easily, and if instead you have smaller urban areas scattered throughout the country that act as poles of attraction for rural economies, and of course the kind of amenities that young people in particular, but not only, are going to want to have. And somehow this didn't happen. And now we're hearing that, well, you know, at this point, we're over the tipping edge and everybody's going to be in cities by et cetera, et cetera. But that just is not necessarily true. Particularly if you look at Africa, I live in Italy, so we're on the receiving end of the boatloads of people who are not immigrating because they have chosen to do so, but because they do not have a livelihood in their home countries. They're people who come from the countryside, and they're continuing to not be able to. The family farmers in Africa are still 80% of the population. It's not happened yet, and there's no alternative employment for them. There's not, you know, when you guys did your enclosure some centuries back, there were jobs for the people who were. I mean, they may have been horrible conditions, but at least, you know, there was industrialization going on, et cetera. That's not the case in Africa. Are we going to pump down for these are political choices? Are we going to make political choices that exacerbate the flood of desperate immigrants, that exacerbate we all know what the link is between this kind of desperation about food, about employment, and terrorism. You know, these are not these are political choices that we can make. So I believe that it's not necessarily true that there won't be. You know, in the UK, I know the proportion of farmers is even lower than in the US, but that's not true all over. And there's still time to make the right political choices elsewhere. So that's one point. The other point that I would underline is that the food sovereignty movement that I've been following really, you know, I was on the spot in 1996 when the term was used globally for the first time, and I've been following its evolution, and it's really been undergoing a process of reaching out. You're right, it was originally a peasant-based movement. That's where it was born, and it was born in Latin America, in fact. And from there, it spread out to other countries, Africa, the north of the world, et cetera, et cetera. Indigenous peoples who are not necessarily on the best neighborhood conditions with peasants always, you know, but there's been this real process of dialoguing, of taking on board a very, very different vision of the relationship between people and nature. You know, you all know this. And urban movements as well. The food sovereignty movement now includes also these various movements of community-based, community support, CSRs, you know what I mean. In the U.S., the people who are doing urban agriculture in food deserts like Detroit and Oakland, who are doing farming themselves, but it's not a different universe. The farmers' markets, this whole, you know, I think it's a big problem. The rural-urban divide is still a big problem, but I think it's not an inevitable problem, and I think it's one that needs to be addressed to bring people together, people who are trying to change things rather than dividing them. Well, of course, my talk was a bit stark for effect, and also because what can you do in a half an hour? But I think the corporation. I personally think it sounds terrible to say this, but I think one of the hopeful aspects of the situation today is that the corporations are just not doing a good job of the assignment they were given. They were given the assignment of ensuring food security. You know, governments have said, well, you know, we need you to get on with it because we don't have the money, and you've got the know-how, and you've got the technology, but it's just not working. And people are feeling the crunch, not just in Africa, but here. And I read in the paper there's a new report out about obesity in the UK. You know, these are problems that are generated by the corporate food system, and so I think that the corporations are still strongly in control, but it's coming to the public eye that they're not doing such a good job of it. So this is why a good deal of my optimism comes from the fact that as people become more aware of these problems and start to take initiatives themselves to ensure that their children, that their families have healthier food, to look at, I understand that the hypermarkets are now undergoing problems. At least in Italy, there's, they're no longer making the undoubted profits that they used to. So I think it's a moment, as I said at the beginning of my talk, it's a moment when the equilibrium is starting to break down. There are enough problems so that there's space to engage.
Thank you for those answers very much. And then Linda Sharp's question about sustainability, social aspects of sustainability as opposed to environmental aspects of sustainability.
Yeah, I think again within the food sovereignty movement, agroecology is not looked at as just a series of sort of technical choices, and this is the conflict with some governments and some corporations that are tending to take on the practices of agroecology without looking at it in a broader way as the social vision that it carries along with it. And in fact, within the food sovereignty movement, there's a melding of the family farm mode of production with agroecological, the logic of the family farm, where you're not after profits on capital, you're after revenues for farmers and families, allied with sustainable, with agroecological approaches to production. And the two, you're right, it's not, just because you're a family farmer doesn't necessarily mean you're going to adopt sustainable methods of production. But the fact that you're small scale, the fact that you have a certain logic of living on the land makes you certainly more amenable to doing so than big industrial plantations, for whom it's a leap in imagination to think that they can reconvert into sustainable production. So I think it's and certainly there's been a building up of the awareness on the part of the food sovereignty movement that you have to couple these things together. You can't just be a small scale producer and that automatically means you're going to be more sustainable. We know that. I don't know if I've answered your question, but there's no single answer. It's a dilemma, certainly. And with regard to the CFS, Tim, what can I say? I said it myself. The more the CFS, the Committee on World Food Security, becomes authoritative and important, the more it's attacked. That's for sure. So the battle is still on. I think the question of making the link with other fora, like did you say that it was civil society that said that the CFS shouldn't?
I think, I'm trying to remember now, but it certainly came out of the Committee on Food Security when they looked at climate change.
But it wasn't civil society. It's some of the governments who try to limit the purview. The Committee on World Food Security has no mandate and no desire to take final decisions on climate change or on trade, but simply to look at these phenomena and look at the policy options that are being negotiated elsewhere and say, this is the implications in terms of food security and the right to food if you choose this way or if you choose that way. And this is the kind of linking that many people think should happen. And those governments who are taking the hardest nosed line in the climate change negotiations or in the WTO try to avoid by saying, oh no, we can't talk about trade in the CFS, or we can't talk about climate change because that's got to be.
I think the problem is that actually what the conclusion that they came to when they looked at climate change, and the CSM were involved in this decision process, I understand it, was that that actually this has to be left to the protocol discussions, the next round of protocol discussions, which are obviously taking place in Paris at the end of the year. This was about 2 years ago. That's the proper forum for it. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about how some of the key drivers you talked about, the potential drivers for change, bottom-up type movements, social movements, are the ways in which we can make this connection more solid, because it doesn't seem to be happening through the CFS at the moment.
I think CFS is part of the process, but the other, big part of the process is for social movements. For example, small-scale producers who are directly impacted by climate change to build up their capacity to weigh in also in the climate change discussions. A problem there is the fact that these movements do not have enormous offices and thousands of people working for them. And that is why their aim is to have the Committee on World Food Security seen and used as an authoritative place to comment on these processes, not to negotiate their outcome, but to make authoritative comments on the processes that have to be taken into account in the WTO, in discussions on trade, in et cetera, because they just don't have the capacity to be there. Of course, advocacy at the national level and the regional level is the other important answer, and this is true across the range of issues. The more people are weighing in and calling governments to account and making.
So, do you see the CFS as really the key body within the UN system? Is the CFS, as it were, become the UN?
On food issues or in general?
Food issues.
I think that the CFS is should be, this is what it's designed to be, the key, foremost inclusive forum which looks at food issues from the viewpoint of food security and the right to food, and which seeks to harmonize policies so that you don't have the WTO going off in one direction and trouncing on food security or climate change, et cetera, seeks to harmonize policies across different venues and within governments too, because we know that often the same government can send people to different global venues and take very different positions.
Was stated as being now the foremost voice on food security, or some term.
Sorry?
The term used was something like foremost voice, or foremost
forum.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. When it was created.
That's right.
And after the revision.
So the revision.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, after the revision. Yeah.
So there was a question about the RSPO, and the trouble is, if you go back to governments, you might end up with the worst scenario.
That is a dilemma. That really is a dilemma, because the people's movements, NGOs tend to be much more, poo-pooey about governments than people's movements, because people's movements are citizens. They live in a country. They know that they can't just ignore the governments, and however difficult it is, they've got to engage with them, and they've got to seek to hold them to account, because they can't count on the WWF or whoever to do it. It's a political process. So of course it's true. It's a difficulty. We know all about corruption. We know the corporations are in Africa, not only in Indonesia. But this has got to be, governments have got to be called to account. You can't solve the problem by taking it out of their hands and setting up some kind of a multi something or another where nobody is accountable.
Vociferous.
Sorry?
Was it vociferous?
Vaporous.
Vaporous. I left that word. I thought that was a good word.
Teresa Webb, a nutritionist. I'd just like to add, really, rather than a question, I really enjoyed the slide, I really enjoyed the presentation as a whole. And your interesting slide on the NO 2040 event that's taking place.
The what?
There's the nano.
Right.
Yeah, and the slide to the right, sort of depicting what seems to me to be a far preferable option, which seems quite ecological in its base. I'm volunteering with the London Permaculture Network and their festival, and it seems very similar in a permaculture element of things. And it's fascinating to hear your take on all these areas as it develops. And I'm just fascinated, and I'd love to know more about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Read my book.
Hi there. So I work on data-driven technologies to help in industries such as agriculture and sustainability. And I was a bit concerned that you played down the importance of technology in your talk. So one of the slides, you had the drones on the picture, and you seem to equate that picture with a corporate view of things. And I would argue that actually the problem is not with technologies, it's with the access of those technologies to the small scale farmers. And in fact, I think unless the small scale producers embrace these technologies and then can incorporate them into their farming practices, they won't be able to compete with the big guys. I was wondering if you could come back on that.
Well, first of all, I admit that I am not a technology fan, and that's because I can't make it work for me, let alone smallholder producers. No, but seriously, there were a number of slides in my talk that were painting things in a black and white way. Of course, technology is very important. It depends on what technology, how it's developed, and one of the key issues is technology developed up here and then sort of thrust onto the fields and into the hands of farmers. This is the whole issue of research, how you conduct research. Do you conduct research starting off from what farmers, what small-scale producers want to know, how they view the problems, what they think the issues are, and then trying to see how science, technology, various kinds of knowledge can be built together to strengthen what they're doing. It depends really if you, I and many people think that it's amazing that family farmers in Africa are managing to still feed 80% of meet 80% of the food demand with no public support whatsoever. On the contrary, having the dice loaded against them. So if we believe that they know what they're doing, we can start off with the logic of their production. We can start off with how they view what their objectives are, and we can say, okay, now what can technology do to help? But that's not the way it happens most of the time. Most of the time you have the Gates Foundation funding agri-dealers who come in with hybrid seeds, who come in with the standard package, and are funded to go off and sell that to the farmers rather than starting from a conversation with the farmers. If that's turned around on its head, then I think of course there's an important role for technology.
So the argument there being it's not Nora's position not against technology, but saying who's framed the technology.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think often we come up with these new technologies and then suddenly try and thrust them on the farming community or other communities, and everyone has to adopt them or die, basically.
Mm-hmm.
It's not actually responding to actual real concerns and issues that growers have. For example, it's saying we've come up with a solution to a problem that we think you have, and they don't actually have it a lot of the time. So I think that's a valid concern.
Yeah.
Could you highlight a few of the ways that the small-scale producers are able to compete with the big guys?
Well, this is the other point that I wanted to come back on, and you've now brought it to my mind. Why should they have to compete? The corporate food system, with the trade rules that comfort it, with structural adjustment. This has been going on for 30 years now, 3 decades of opening up markets in the South to unfair competition with products. I'm sure you've all heard about dumping that get onto the world market at below production costs because of subsidies of various kinds. All of this has been taking place. And the economic partnership agreements are the latest in this list of measures that have been imposed from outside. The agricultural credit rates in West Africa are at the level of about 25%, as compared with 5% in Europe. How can they possibly compete? And why should they? Until such time as the politicians of the powerful regions like Europe and North America decide that it's in everybody's interest to create a world in which everybody can live according to the way they want to live, the only choice they have is to protect their markets. And that's what the food sovereignty, that's one plank of the food sovereignty agenda, is to say enough of this competition. In fact, the World Bank states quite clearly that Africa is the last frontier for agribusiness. Because of the growing population, growing urbanization, who is going to meet the growing demand? Is it going to be? Of course, it will be the corporations if there's not an enabling environment created for the small-scale producers. But the consequences of these choices are enormous. If you think of what the future of these people are, of their societies, of their foods, so the whole question of what kind of competition should there be and on whose grounds is a very important one.
Sorry, I just add to that, the foreign direct investment is a key thing as much as the trading rules. Because
absolutely, you're right.
Given your corporate regime picture, that's how the corporations, and that's why we've only got around 9% of processed foods internationally traded, because they're actually assembled in the marketplace by the multinationals who have got their stake in those national marketplaces.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We have time for just a few more questions. 14 minutes.
So, I mean, the investors we work with, if they want to contribute to a food system that does benefit the environment and the society, but they're obviously also going to be invested in big food companies because that is what provides the returns. Is there any role for the big corporations in this system? Like, is there anything that an investor can encourage them to do to contribute to it? Or are they, as an investor, better off getting out? But then in what case, what would be the alternative investments that would promote a better system?
That is a very hotly debated issue. I personally think that the big agri-food corporations operate according to a logic, and I repeat, it's not that they're bad guys. It's just it's the way they operate. It's their logic. It's the scale of their operations. It's what they have to do. They're there to make a profit, and the logic of the corporate food system is such that, this is my belief, a bit of doctoring so that you source your sugar from here and not there, or you're careful to will not do the trick. And what needs to be supported, what sorely needs to be supported and is under-supported, are the, for now, many scattered, more difficult to support local initiatives that are coming up. So I'm not the right person to talk to if you want, if you want to have a...
Does anyone think there is a room for investment in a different way? A different question. Maybe that was a rhetorical question.
Very worrying if there aren't any answers.
I hoped you would say that. I was trying to give you a chance to say something. I mean, do you think
Yeah,
that
what would you say?
the world is awash with money, actually, looking for a home? And I thought behind your question was, well, what do we do with that? If it's not going through the corporations, where could it go? I mean, you had a picture up. Can I add to your question? You had a picture up, Nora, with Professor Conway in the bottom left-hand corner. He's someone who's argued that Africa needs doubling the investment in farms to increase the output of small farms to feed Africa. It needs investment. There's lots of ways where investment should go into African agriculture.
Yeah, but I don't know what the alternatives are. Is it investing in government bonds? Is it? I think that's the problem. That these investment vehicles, they just
you're talking about investors like pension funds and things like that.
Pension funds and foundations, and where are they supposed to put their money to actually help a system like this?
The classic argument is infrastructure. It's infrastructure that's needed. Infrastructure, water systems, drainage systems where it's wet, roads, storage, infrastructure, not taking the money off and processing it and making the money. And that was the point I was raising earlier about where is the money in food. It's not on the land, it's off the land. where all the money's made, off the land. And actually that's distorted. I go further than you do. I think there is a huge need for this wall of money in the City of London, in Tokyo, in New York, to be invested in agricultural infrastructure.
Green agriculture.
The right
In
kind
green
of
agricultural infrastructure.
agricultural infrastructure. Yeah.
So that's one of my criticisms, not of you, but of a lot of the rhetoric of the critics of the current food system. Says nasty corporations, which many are, but many aren't, or some aren't. But it's missing the point about investment. Investment is sorely needed in the food system. If we want a low carbon, highly nutritious, ecosystems-friendly food system, wow, have we got to put a lot of money in.
Yeah, but what's happening now?
I would have thought you'd agree with that.
No, I do, but what's happening now is that in many countries, Africa is the region I know best, there actually are agriculture and food security policies that in many cases, not all, are developed with participation by small-scale producers and other stakeholders. And these policies are sitting there. They have been inclusively developed. They're sitting there, and the investment comes in totally different directions. It comes in where the corporations think they can make a profit. They come in through programs like the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition, which is incredibly pernicious because it's pushing governments to make policy changes that are outside of this kind of discursive, deliberative modality. So the investment is needed, but it has to be directed to those things that the society inclusively decides are beneficial. And in fact, the report, the Committee on World Food Security report that I quoted from, its main recommendation is that countries should develop national visions, nationally owned visions of the future of small-scale farming, and should apply these visions across the range of policies and programs and investments to be made. And that's really the key. I mean, it's how you decide what to invest in the name of what that counts. If you've got that there and if you respect it, then there's plenty of scope.
Do you want to come back? I think we got somewhere interesting on that.
Yeah.
Do you want to come back, or are you happy with that?
I didn't know that. Yeah.
No, I think that's, yeah, you pass it back. Without touching it.
I think the Kit Kat is the most popular chocolate bar in the UK, and it comes with a lovely fair trade label stamped on it. Is that label believable, and is it sufficient? Are the standards they set sufficient to get that recognition?
Do you know enough about Kit Kat and this obsession with...
It's a Nestle product, just to...
It's a Nestle chocolate bar. It's a chocolate bar.
No, I know what Kit Kat is. Okay. Yes, yeah. No, I do indeed. I was trying to wonder how rough I can be, but I mean I have. This is Parliament, right? Okay. My take on fair trade is that, of course, there are a whole series of things that go under the name of fair trade. Some of them are more serious than others. Some of them are limited to environmental issues. Others take into account social and the condition of workers, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I personally think that fair trade is not my priority. It's not my priority because it's inevitably going to be a minimal part of the way trade is done, and because I believe that the future of small-scale producers in the countries that are being sourced really lies in supply chains that they can control. Of course, cocoa, coffee, the so-called colonial products are a different issue because they have an export vocation, shall we say. So if you like, there's a niche for these kinds of products.
Do you have thoughts on part of your question was about label? You were interested in the label. Nora, you've given the position on fair trade in Tokyo, which is great. Do you have any views in sort of the bipolar world that you've presented, where does labelling fit? I ought to say, because our next Food Thinkers here seminar series is actually going to be on labelling.
Oh, really?
It's going to be Christine Parker on the potential of the food label as democratic governance.
Haha, interesting,
So,
yeah.
You're going to have to come back.
Well,
What do you think about labels?
my thoughts about labels are that there are labels and labels, of course. It depends on who's labeling to do what with. Clearly, the California referendum to make it obligatory to indicate whether or not there are GMOs in food is to be a referendum to be won. I mean, clearly consumers have a right to know what's in the food they're being asked to purchase, and that's the bottom line. I think there's a danger if you take that too far, and if you think that you're going to change the food system by putting responsibility on the shoulders of individual consumers who have to make good choices every time they go to the markets and buy one product rather than another. There are also, there are many. I come from Italy, where labeling in terms of geographic, how do you say that in Italian? Geographical origins is a very powerful tool, because it really does give value. What do you value in a value chain, and who decides what you value in a value chain? That kind of labeling can value the territorially rooted nature of a product, and the cultural aspects, et cetera. So that that's another factor to take into account, which is quite a different thing than I'm sure the Kit Kat label. And it's interesting also that even the organic labeling is another big piece of the story. But there too, there are moves underway now to develop approaches to organic labeling that are not in the hands of the big certification outfits who charge often quite expensive fees. I mean, the whole process of getting your products stamped with a label of organic can be very onerous, particularly for the smaller producers. And there's a very interesting process underway these days in part of the world of IFWAM, sort of the progressive wing of IFWAM, to develop different approaches to certification that involve that are much more democratic, if you like, that involve, they're territorially situated, and they involve teams of consumers, producers, whatever, visiting the farmers, and it's just a different way of going about labeling. So, in conclusion, I think labeling can be a very good thing, but there are many different kinds of labeling, and you have to see how it's being done in the interests of whom and who's benefiting.
Just want to come back, okay?
I've said enough, actually.
Do have a last word, because we're going to wrap up.
I'm coming from a consumer point of view, really. I could go to a local farm shop and buy my vegetables and potatoes from an English farm, organic, local, and pay a little bit more. Or I could get it from Aldi or Lidl or any cheap supermarket. If I took the ethical option, potentially, I've denied the third world an income source. So have I made the right decision in buying locally? But I'm denying people who need my money an income source.
I think that's quite fallacious, actually, because first of all, the people, the small-scale producers in the South, are not exporting fruits and vegetables to their products do not compete with the
because of the common agricultural policy. But if we got rid of that, then would they not want to? Or not?
No. I mean, even where they have, if you look, for example, at the well-studied chain of green beans from West Africa, Burkina Faso, to France and to Italy, where actually they were imported by the big co-ops. It was part of this. We want to support the incomes of small-scale producers, and they've turned out to be really fiascos, because what small-scale producers need is to have access to and to be able to control their own markets. You know, that's where their future is. Their future is in their own markets. And once you're sucked into a global supply chain, you just don't control it. You know, suppose as happened, the cooperatives of Toscana decide to just drop green beans the next day. You know, all of these farmers in Burkina Faso who had built up their capacity to feed that chain were left out on a limb. So this is my strong conviction is that, I mean, obviously you're not going to buy everything local. If you want a banana and you have, you know, but buying local in the UK is supportive of people who want to sell local and buy local in other parts of the world. It's not a conflict, I believe.